The series has been organised by the BSA's Families and Relationships Study Group, which is co-convened by myself, Alison Lamont, Charlotte Fairclough and Catherine Tramley. I'm sure they're on the screen, they can give you a wave to introduce themselves. So, to explain the study group broadly aims to provide a forum to bring BSA members together and to promote dialogue between those with an interest in and a focus on the sociology of family, intimacies and relationships, as well as related areas such as gender, sexualities and transnational families. For any of you that aren't members of the study group or the BSA, please do look at the BSA website and explore the benefits of being a member of either. So we've organised the webinar series in order to embed our efforts to decolonise scholarship in the global area of sociology, as the study of family has long been critiqued for its heteronormativity, its whiteness and reproduction of specific privileged family forms. But in recent decades, families and relationship studies has of course expanded and attended to an increasingly diverse range of relationships and non-normative households. But research remains white in focus, European, and citation practices do continue to privilege white male scholars of the global north. So as part of our endeavour for what Gominda Bambra refers to as achieving connected sociologies, and in light of the recent Black Lives Matter movement, our study group's holding 3 events, which will aim to explore new ways of thinking about and understanding families and relationships. This is the first of those, the next is on the 24th of March, and the final one is on the 18th of June. So keep your eyes open for invites to those. So in this, our first webinar, the focus of this session is colonial perspectives on intimacy and masculinities. And the session will open with our plenary speaker, Professor Vrushali Patil, followed by 3 speakers. So we have Sharon Curry-Kosa-Phillip, Alan Kim and Mona Roehm. We ask that you save your questions until the speakers have presented, but you can ask questions at the bottom via the Q&A function. When you do write your question, if it's for one specific speaker, please identify it as such. And Alison's going to collate the questions and then we'll come back together at the end to discuss that. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Catherine to introduce Vrushali. So thank you, over to Catherine.
Great, thanks, Julie. So I'm really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for the webinar series on decolonising the sociology of family and relationships. Dr. Vrushali Patil is Associate Professor of Sociology at the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies at Florida International University. And I was lucky enough to visit Vrushali around about this time last year, actually, for 6 weeks, back when those things were possible. And I'm really looking forward to when they're possible again. I was obviously on sabbatical at the time. And FIU's in Miami, which I think is a really fascinating place to consider post-colonial studies and the sociology of race and ethnicity. At least from a European perspective, it's an incredibly diverse city, but with a very different history and kind of makeup of residents from most European cities and certainly UK cities. I really enjoyed my time there, and I learned so a lot from Vrushali and her other colleagues. So I really want to thank her for facilitating my visit, which was suggested and somewhat imposed by myself. Vrushali's scholarship is really exciting and just completely on point, I think, to what we're trying to get at in our series of webinars. Her writing and teaching is at the intersection of gender and sexuality studies, post-colonial studies, and historical sociology. I have been drawing on her work in my own scholarship in teaching, for example, in a module in UCL on love and intimacy. And the connections she makes between macro and micro processes, as well as temporal and geographical spaces, is really quite impressive. She's published in ethnic and racial studies, sociological theory, signs, and an extremely long list of very impressive journals. And she's currently working on a book entitled Empire and the Social Construction of Sex, Gender, and Sexuality from Societies to Web Connectivities. So I hope that we'll get a little bit of a taste of that. And if not, perhaps we can pose some questions on it. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Vrushali.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I just want to begin by saying thank you to Catherine and to the other organizers of this webinar for inviting me to be here. I'm so thrilled to be here. Now let's see if I can share. I need to share. There we go. All right. So what does it mean to decolonize families and intimacies? I speak from the heart of a declining empire, where the administration has ripped immigrant children from their families, where a white supremacist contingent has decided this is okay, that these brown families represent a threat and their destruction is acceptable to protect the nation. The travels of these families from Central America to the US and the US's treatment, for which it has received no sanction, point to a geography of power, legitimacy, violence, pain, and trauma. In what Maria Lugones called colonial modernity, we live in a world of varied legitimacies and violences when it comes to intimacies. Within colonial modernity, cis, heterosexual, white families and intimacies receive recognition and protection in law, becoming the bedrock of the definition of nation, community, and family itself, while the intimacies of racialized, non-binary, and queer people become defined as external to the nation, community, and notions of family. Judith Butler gave us a particular term for thinking about hegemonic visions of intimacy. The screen should be changing. It's not changing. Okay. I don't know what's going on, you guys.
Maybe try stop sharing and start sharing again.
Okay.
Sometimes.
No. What if I just did it like this? I wonder if that would work. Okay. All right. Is this okay?
Yep. Yeah,
That's fine.
Okay. I don't know what's going on there. Okay. So she gave us a particular term for thinking about hegemonic visions of intimacy, right? The heterosexual matrix. And she defined it as, quote, that grid of cultural intelligibility through which bodies, gender, and desires are naturalized, where there must be a stable sex expressed through a stable gender. Masculine expresses male, feminine expresses female, that is oppositionally and hierarchically defined through the compulsory practice of heterosexuality. And with this concept of the heterosexual matrix, she sought to critique basically the heteronormative and cisnormative basis of hegemonic notions of family and intimacy. And I reference this matrix here because I believe this framework has been very important in how feminist and queer sociologists have approached questions of family and intimacy. And yet, this matrix doesn't really have much to say about those Central American families at the US border, right? Or Native American families whose children were stolen and sent to boarding schools, right? Or Black families that were ripped apart by slave masters, or Black and brown families today who are seen as a demographic threat to a white nation. So what I want to talk about today is how this hegemonic vision of family and intimacy that I think many of us are working with, named by Butler as the heterosexual matrix, which presents itself as universal, is in fact far from universal and premised on empire and whiteness. I contend that questions of cisnormativity and heteronormativity are not separate from questions of race and empire. Rather, these multiple normativities work together with race and empire in order to shape whose families are a threat or don't matter, whose families count and must be protected. So what I want to do today is I want to introduce two new concepts. First is my theoretical framework of webbed connectivities. I think maybe part of it is cut off on your screen, depending on how you can see this. But web connectivities, this is a relational framework that highlights the web of imperial networks that cross and connect spaces from the proto-colonial period and on. In contrast to state-centric approaches and approaches that neglect empire, I situate the emergence of this sort of hegemonic vision named by Butler as the heterosexual matrix squarely within the web connectivities of proto-colonial and colonial networks. The second concept is thinking sideways. We often assume, given spatial societal boundaries, and examine social processes within these boundaries. Instead, thinking sideways is a methodological tactic that traces relations, networks, and connections that cross receive sites. So what I want to do is I want to think sideways, and I want to follow early modern web connectivities across geopolitical and other borders, tracking how they eventually help to produce this hegemonic heterosexual matrix and its vision of intimacy and family. Okay. To start, in the context of the early modern period, the term web connectivities highlights the cross-border imperial networks constituted by merchant capital, imperializing, colonizing states, the Catholic Church, material culture, and the emerging Western sciences. The window on this period from my discussion today is going to be the material culture of travel writing, which was produced by the mostly white European men of the means who traveled to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. These men traveled on behalf of the Catholic Church or mercantile capital or metropolitan science or royal prerogatives, and their writings circulated via the webbed connectivities of early colonial and proto-colonial institutions and structures. Their writing is important sociologically because it was one of the most significant ways in which knowledge was produced about the other at this time. The authors of these travel texts were also coming from a particular view of sex, gender, and sexuality dominant in European Christendom at this time. Regarding sex, for example, the predominant humoral theory of the body taught that the body was made up of four humors, and as the humors shifted, the components of the body changed also. Maleness and femaleness resulted from the combination of humors an individual possessed. Because the humors were unstable, the sex body was not stable. So while women were considered inferior and more lustful, this capability for transformation meant that the lines between women and men weren't entirely clear. In this context, while there was some condemnation of sodomy, sodomy itself was unclearly defined and regulated depending on who was committing it. So a sexual act didn't necessarily translate into an identity, nor did the gender status of one's partner define one as heterosexual or homosexual. Relatedly, the notion of the hermaphrodite did not signal something between two clearly defined poles of male and female, but rather more general notions of ambiguousness and effeminacy and social, sexual, and gender deviance and transgression. European travel writers at this time, then, they witnessed practices which fell outside of such ideologies, and their stories of other lands are filled with sodomites and hermaphrodites and unregulated sexuality and women's sexual treachery. So I want to share with you just a few examples of what I'm talking about here. These are two of the two illustrations which circulated with two of the most influential travel narratives of this time. So on the left there, you see an image from the Itinerario, which was a publication by the Dutch writer Van Linschoten. It came out at the end of the 1500s. Van Linschoten had worked for the Archbishop of Goa in Portuguese India, and he wrote about his experiences when he returned to Europe, including illustrations like this. The image shows sati, the practice of widow burning, where the widow is burned on her husband's funeral pyre. This practice was engaged in by a small minority of groups and had long been an exotic focus in texts on India. What Van Linschoten did, however, is that he associated it specifically with Indian women's sexual treachery. He wrote that, quote, these whores, unquote, were so lustful that they poisoned their husbands in order to be able to fulfill their lust. He claimed that the king actually invented sati in order to prevent this kind of sexual treachery on the part of these women. And this text is significant not just for its exoticism and its misogyny, but for how it was taken up and put to use. It came at a time when the Portuguese were still generally unchallenged in the East, and it represented them as a corrupt and declining power and provided sort of Portuguese secrets on safe travel to the East. The Dutch government immediately understood the value of the work and gave him license to publish it. And the work is credited with the establishment and success of the Dutch East India Company. It was translated into Latin, English, and French, and is also said to have directly contributed to the discoveries and the conquests made by the French and the English in the Far East. The image on the right was inserted in a republication of a text by the French writer Ledonnier on his experiences in a French colony in the Americas, also at the end of the 1500s. The text described the life and customs of the Timucua Indians of Florida. And of particular note here are the descriptions of hermaphrodites in the New World, which he described as being especially compelled to do physical labor. And that's what you see in the image there. And this text is also significant for how it was taken up and put to use. Originally published in French, it was immediately translated into English by a publisher who wanted to promote English colonization in the Americas. It was then published again in Latin and German by another publisher who wanted to promote Protestant colonization to the Americas. And that second publisher added engravings, including this one here. This association of hermaphroditic bodies with indigenous peoples in the New World would comprise some of the very first visual images of indigenous peoples in the Americas to circulate across Europe. Beyond these images, early modern travel writers also wrote about Muslims who were associated with gender deviance and sodomy. They wrote about Southern Africa, which was said to be rife with unrestricted sexual behavior where, quote, women and children were held in common, unquote. And around the world, this writing claimed, lazy, savage men forced women to engage in physical labor and failed to respect their chastity. So this sort of exoticized, racialized, gendered writing on the other emerged as a part of burgeoning colonial designs and institutions. And as interesting colonization grew, reprintings and translations of this work circulated these writings even further. And so the ways in which these texts circulated, constructed the other, circulated, right, well past their initial context of emergence. Such constructions are significant then, because over the 1700s, they would sort of become the data drawn on by canonical Enlightenment writers as they considered universal questions of nature and history and civilization and society. And so sex, gender, sexuality, family, intimacy. So I want to share with you a few examples of what I'm talking about here. On the left is an example of a particularly significant publication in 1741 by the English Dr. James Parsons, Fellow of the Royal Society. Within the emerging geography of sexual, anatomical, and gender deviance being created by travel writing, Parsons now made a new kind of claim about bodies. He argued, hermaphrodites don't actually exist, certainly not in Europe. Rather, seeming hermaphrodites are simply deviant African and Asian women. Such women exhibited excessive and illicit sexuality and so possessed enlarged clitorises. For Parsons, their anatomical deviance had been mistaken for the existence of hermaphrodites, but we could safely locate their transgressive bodies and intimacies elsewhere and secure normative bodies and intimacies here. What we see happening in this text then is what I call a spatialization of normative versus deviant bodies and eroticisms, where anatomical deviance is excised elsewhere in order to secure binary sex here. And I argue that this is a constitutive dimension in the move from that humoral theory of unstable sex difference to eventually a biological theory of fixed heteronormative sex difference. The spatialization of normative sex was elaborated further in the realm of natural history. For example, in his canonical natural history that's shown in the middle there, the French Comte de Buffon drew on travel writing to discuss civilized versus savage relations between women and men around the world. Buffon wrote, quote, "All men are naturally indolent, but the savages of warm countries are not only the most lazy of human beings, but the most tyrannical to their women whom they treat with a cruel barbarity," unquote. For Buffon, lazy savages force women to engage in labor unsuited to their weaker constitutions, in opposition to the civilized world, where women are relieved of this labor. Buffon also writes about the, quote, "abominable outrages," unquote, of savages, which fail to respect women's virginity before marriage, again in opposition to the respect for women's virginity in the civilized world. His Natural History of Man, then, augments Parsons' spatialization of normative versus deviant bodies with a concordant spatialization of civilized versus savage gender relations and heterosexuality. A third side of Enlightenment writing, conjectural history, elaborates especially the social historical dimension of this spatialization. For example, the Scottish writer John Miller, shown on the right there, wrote that at the, quote, "most savage stage," unquote, sex is unregulated and women's chastity has no value, rendering women of no value. And so women are subjected to innumerable harms, from being abused as laborers to being treated as property. Miller writes that as societies develop, women's sexuality becomes regulated and the value of their chastity increases. So their value and treatment improve, and they take on their rightful role, quote, "rearing and maintaining children," unquote. While Miller is ostensibly concerned about the abuse of women, his essentialist and patriarchal views shape what he considers abuse. So, for example, in his survey of savages, he includes clear instances of women's power and status, such as their participation in public governance institutions and matriarchal forms of kinship in which women have access to and power over multiple men. However, he saw those kinds of practices as uncivilized. And rather, monogamous heterosexual marriage enfolding a private domestic femininity and a public masculinity emerge as the highest stage of civilization. And so in conjunction with the spatial politics of normative versus deviant bodies and gender and sexuality emerging in sites like medicine, anatomy, natural history, Miller offers a socio-historical framing wherein these normativities are also the effect of a higher level of development. And again, like the travel writing that they drew on, these texts would themselves be translated into multiple languages and circulated, becoming deeply influential in Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thought on nature, civilization, and progress. I argue that such writers actually helped inaugurate new ideas of bodies, gender, and sexualities, working with racialized gendered knowledges of the outside world, produced and circulated via early modern webbed connectivities. Their myriad theorizations inaugurated a shift, which would grow increasingly powerful from the dominant humoral understanding of the unstable body and its attendant ideas about gender and sexuality. Together, they helped produce a new grid of intelligibility centered on a, quote, "stable sex," expressed through a stable gender. Masculine expresses male, feminine expresses female, that is oppositionally and hierarchically defined through the compulsory practice of heterosexuality, unquote. What Butler would eventually name the heterosexual matrix. I argue then that this matrix, this sort of basic vision of heteronormative embodiment and hierarchical gender relations and sexuality, which animates our hegemonic definitions of intimacy and thus family, is an effect of these racialized imperial networks. This vision of family does not simply exist, which would suggest an essentialism. Rather, it gains legibility against other embodiments, behaviors, and eroticisms in a broader network of colonial relations. Although it relies on coloniality, however, it erases the colonial conditions of its production. So then what does it mean to decolonize families and intimacies? We have typically critiqued the power relations this matrix enacts in terms of sexuality, gender, and bodies. We have had a lot less to say about the racial and imperial conditions of possibility for these normativities. I think that while there are multiple pathways to forge as we come up against the coloniality of our knowledges, we must begin with histories of race and empire. Methodologically and theoretically, this requires at base a challenge to the presentism and state centrism that continue to be dominant in sociology. In their stead, thinking sideways across historic and contemporaneous web connectivity centers race and empire in the making of legitimate and illegitimate intimacies. And so in the making of whose families are a threat or don't matter, whose families count and must be protected, I think thinking sideways across imperial web connectivities, I believe, can help us begin the journey towards decolonizing families and intimacies. Thank you.
Thank you, Vrushali, for a really fascinating plenary and some conceptual thinking and theoretical thinking that really provides the framework for the whole series of webinars and the next 3 presentations that we're about to hear. Can I remind people that are present and a few people that have come a little bit later that we're going to save questions till the end. If you can ask any questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, that would be great. Okay then, so first I'm going to hand over to Shannon Curicosa-Phillip. Shannon is a postdoctoral research associate at the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on the complex realities of sexualities, masculinities and gender in post-colonial India. And he's now going to speak about this in a paper entitled Queering the Indian Family. So to hand over to you, Shannon, thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here, to be talking to all of you. I'm very happy. And it's wonderful also to go after Vrushali, because I'll also be talking about the heterosexual matrix a little bit and situating that within a ethnography. So a little bit, like Julie's already mentioned, I am an urban sociologist. So I'm very interested in questions of urban spaces, urbanity, and how it's sort of relationally built. And I'm also very keen on the idea of decolonizing sociology and methods of sociology. So building on Butler's idea of the heterosexual matrix, I want to apply that into an ethnography and then pull out various themes. So I don't really have a PowerPoint to show you, but I have a few images. So I will share that with you. And I'll make sure that I stick to the time. So I'll read this vignette so that it's quicker and that it's clearer. I hope you can see the screen. Alison.
So we're seeing most of your screen, but it's not centered in. Maybe if you could click F5. Yeah, there we go. That's better. Yeah, thanks.
There's a slight problem because I need another document. Would this work? Would this be okay?
Yes, I think that's fine.
Yeah. So it's really just for this particular image that I wanted you to have a look at, which is of my informant. This is the young man that I'll be talking about, and his name is Ratish. He's a young man living in New Delhi right now. So perhaps I could stop sharing the screen. So Ratish, who you just saw, is a 25-year-old unmarried Indian man who lives with his parents and his sister in South Delhi, very close to where I was doing fieldwork for my doctorate. Ratish and I met at a cigarette stall in our neighborhood and became acquainted with each other. Over the course of many months living in South Delhi, Ratish became a key informant of mine, and I got to know him better. I met his family, we hung out in shopping malls, gay cruising parks, frequented the many bars and sort of cafes mushrooming in South Delhi. Ratish introduced me to a few young women he was casually dating, and also to several men that he had various relationships with. Ratish worked for the Indian National Railways, a job that his father helped him get, and he took particular care of his clothes to make sure that he got the right look that he wanted. In the evenings, we would often meet outside his block of flats and walk over to an abandoned parking lot where other young guys would hang out, smoke, play cricket, or simply be. Ratish and I would sit in the parking lot, have cigarettes, and chat about various things, from girls, the pressures to have an arranged marriage, various stresses at work, and general news and gossip. The parking lot away from the gaze of the middle-class family homes, but close enough to enjoy the status and privilege of being in an allegedly nice neighborhood. One evening, when I was visiting Ratish's home, waiting for him to get ready, his mother said to me, "You must keep Ratish safe from girls when you go out and about into Delhi. Girls have become very dangerous in Delhi. They are always tricking these innocent boys." Not knowing how to respond to this comment, I simply smiled at Ratish's mother and laughed. Later, I told Ratish in jest that his mother said that we ought to be careful when going around. Ratish laughed this off as his mother's fear and told me, "As young guys, we have to go out and we have to learn to be in the world." Then, in a rather poetic tone, he added, "If men spend too much time inside the house, they get spoiled. And if women spend too much time outside the house, they get spoiled." Ratish and I then boarded the metro and went to central Delhi, to the commercial heart of the city. We walked straight to a gay cruising park where we used to spend time hanging out with each other. Ratish never liked going inside the park and preferred to stay on the peripheries of the park. He explained to me, "Inside the park are all the cheap boys. They are constantly mincing and moving their bodies, clapping and making noises, simply trying to get attention and cause trouble. I get so angry when I see them." Ratish's disregard for poorer and more working class people who use the insides of the park meant that he, as a middle class Indian young man from an allegedly good neighborhood, preferred to be outside on the peripheries of the park. He explained to me further that boys inside the park don't care about themselves or their families. They have no respect, no honor. They are simply after one thing, and they are not like us. Now, on the peripheries of the park, in order to attract a suitable partner, Ratish had an elaborate embodied ritual. Ratish preferred to bottom and sought suitably middle-class top partners for sex. In order to do so, Ratish felt that he had to demonstrate not just his class, but his preferred sexual position, while also being discreet and appearing to be respectable. In order to do so, Ratish showed me how to use my eyes and my hips. The use of eyes and hips he demonstrated to me numerous times and was occasionally also successful. He would catch the eye of a male partner he was attracted to, and then quickly act coy and shy and look down and then back up again, as if he was too embarrassed to have been caught looking. This elaborate pretense with the eyes often involved him pouting his lips and arching his back to accentuate and demonstrate his bottom position. If this succeeded in attracting a suitable mate, I noticed that Ratish would then change the way he spoke and become slightly playful and flirtatious. However, as soon as the time came to exit the cruising park, Ratish would tell me that it was time to straighten up now and be normal. He often said to me, "Time for mischief and fun are over now." He would then physically straighten his body and we would walk back to the train to head home. So this vignette is one of several vignettes that I have in my work, in my thesis, and with several young men who I worked with ethnographically, but also did sort of semi-structured interviews and various other kinds of work. And the vignette has all kinds of themes that are at play. And some of the themes that I want to pull out in the brief few minutes that I have are perhaps around family and masculinity here and sexuality and how it's playing out, particularly in the context of sort of neo-colonial relationships in India and neo-colonial ideas of respectability and the respectable body, the respectable family. Vrushali has already talked about the colonial context and the coloniality aspect of how global economic relationships are shaping up identities of gender, of embodiment for young men like Ritesh. So he, for example, shops in H&M or Zara and looks at sort of commodified images, very similar to Western images of men and masculinity that occupy our society, let's say British society here in Britain. So there's a commodification of gender, and there's a particular idea, a classed and racialized idea of gender and the body that also emerge, that have to be then played out in these respectable ways, according to Ritesh. Right? And India, of course, has a much longer history of non-respectable ways of being, non-sort of gender or classified objects of desire and sexual acts. So for example, I don't use the colonial term of heterosexual or gay or straight or bi for Ritesh in this decolonial vein. I think I want to keep all the complexities of his identity quite open and present for us to think about. You know, the messy dynamics, the messy politics of his sexuality at play, which we cannot, I think, take away from the various sort of global, economic, and social forces also at play within his local context. The one other thought I want to make is about the heteropatriarchal family. And again, to go back to Butler and Vrushali's discussion about the heteropatriarchy and heterosexual matrix, Butler's talking about the pretense of this matrix, or the pretense of the heterosexual family. And I think in the vignette, it becomes very evident how space relationally constructs the respectable family home and sort of dirty, seedy cruising park, right? And I think in sociology, when we are thinking about self and relationships or family relationships, there's an emphasis on thinking about the home and these sort of respectable forms of home and homemaking, the process of understanding the heterosexual family from the home. But what I'm also proposing, I think, in this decolonial and sort of queering perspective is to value the cruising park itself or various dirty places as equally important sites where respectability, ideas of the family are made and unmade, where desire is acting out, where gender is acting out in very complex ways. So with that, I think I want to sort of destabilize the heteronormative understanding of families and of individuals in the family and somehow extend our thinking there. So I'll leave it there. I've come to the end of my 10 minutes, but I'm sure there'll be more discussion and we could pull out more themes. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you for a really engaging and detailed account of your ethnography in India and your analysis and critique from a neo-colonial and post-colonial perspective. And as before, I'm sure there'll be many questions at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Alan. So I would like to introduce Alan Kim, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan. So today, Alan is going to consider the impact of white Western performances of masculinity on Korean masculinities with a focus on fatherhood. So the title of Alan's paper is Korean Masculine Makeovers in the Father School Movement. So I'll hand over to you, Alan.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Julie Walsh. I appreciate all the speakers that have spoken before me. I'm here today just to basically share my 10-year journey with a non-Western men's movement that originated in South Korea. And essentially it's a story about how men undergo a transition from being a distant Korean patriarch toward being an expressive dad. And so the picture, this PowerPoint's gonna have a lot of pictures, okay? So I'm gonna just kind of give you a quick warning. So this is actually the uniform worn by men of this men's movement called Father School, okay? It looks a lot like the Promise Keepers if you are not familiar with that particular movement. So I'm actually having an issue. Okay, actually I'm not having an issue. So this is really kind of a topic that kind of touches on Western hegemonic masculinity, and the question that kind of is raised here is like, how does the dominance of Western masculinity affect men in non-Western regions? how do Korean men facing a changing economic and gender order respond? And so we'll kind of go through this journey together here. So to kind of provide you some background, what was occurring during the rise of this particular movement in 1995 was the Asian economic IMF crisis, where essentially you were kind of experiencing the destabilization of Korean masculinity, right? So you have this economic crisis. It hits white collar men, and what resulted was a rise in married women in the workforce, low birth rate, increase in divorce, and men really were kind of questioning their role in their family. And so really there was kind of a cultural opportunity for this particular movement to kind of take place in South Korea. So again, Father School kind of was formed really at a mega church in South Korea, and it was in response to this kind of growing epidemic of what they call abusive, ineffective, and absentee Korean dads. And this particular movement has expanded to more than 55 countries worldwide. More than like 300,000 men have graduated from this particular kind of intensive gender boot camp, which is kind of an article that I wrote previously about how this this kind of intensive men's program essentially trains men to become more involved fathers and husbands. And this is actually a picture in South Korea. And in Korean it says, if the father thrives, the family will thrive. Okay, so really kind of placing a lot of importance on the role and the responsibility of the dad in the family, not only to change relationships with children and relationships with actually adult fathers, but also actually to transform society more broadly. So these are some of the research questions that I'd like to just share with you. How does Father School actually reconstruct masculinity in response to the changing gender order? Do they draw on white Western masculinity, and how so? And then finally, and this is more kind of from my more recent research, it's like, in what ways have leaders actually moved beyond, what I observe as kind of the glorification or the elevation of Western men in terms of the rhetoric and at these Father School conferences. So this is data that I've collected over many years in different programs that I've attended throughout South Korea. So they also include actually men's handwritten letters, which is a component of their homework assignment. So men are actually given homework assignment to write letters to all their family members, go on dates, learn how to engage their family members in more expressive ways. Things that would be considered strange for maybe Western families, right? Which would be considered a lot more normative, is really something that actually these men actually have to practice and learn. Okay, so I'm actually just going to provide a top-down portrait of this organization in the interest for time. And so essentially how the organization or the leaders frame the problem is that they disparage the salaryman, which is also kind of a term that's used in Japan as well, where it's this kind of work-obsessed white-collar worker, and it's kind of phenomenon that's contributed to this fatherless household. And this particular salaryman doesn't really have healthy communication with his family, and is a male figure who's essentially physically and emotionally absent from the family. And so in the Korean case, there's these arguments that the leaders kind of promote, is that the men are too Confucianistic, they're patriarchal, violent, bad-tempered, again, poor communicators, and there's this kind of idea that essentially that Korean dads in the family are really the loser in many ways. Okay, and so not only have they kind of diagnosed the problem, but they also obviously as a movement kind of pro-offered the solution. And in doing so, they kind of really kind of are complicit with Western hegemonic masculinity in the sense of they kind of idealize this kind of new father ideal, right? This is caring, emotionally expressive, intimate, involved parent, and also the new man ideology, right? Which the organization associates with white American men. So at the very beginning of my kind of journey with this particular men's movement, like you see these kind of images of white men doing it right? White men who really kind of are serving as kind of a model or a normative ideal for what men should kind of aspire to, right? And it's at the same time as a religiously inspired movement too. I mean, there's kind of a religious foundation to this, but in terms of like what the images you find at these conferences, it was very clear that white men were being, you know, these images were being kind of shown kind of repeatedly. That image on the very bottom is actually an example of the Promise Keeper movement, which they showed in the very beginning of my research many years ago. And so the Promise Keepers was just kind of like this new kind of a Christian movement to kind of assert men's role in the family, their responsibility in society, etc. It's a movement, by the way, it's no longer operative, right? They used to kind of fill these humongous stadiums, and what's interesting now is that it's been replaced with like non-Western men, and so I found that to be really interesting. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jeremy Lin, but I'll give you some other examples here. So what you find recently now is that you don't find actually images of white men in happy, loving families anymore. They're actually replaced with images of Asian men who are involved, who are loving, who are doting their children. And a lot of this was kind of started in 2013, where you had these kind of reality television shows focusing on men. One show called The Return of Superman, which was exported to China, to Southeast Asia, and all of these other places. So you see these like amazing stars, soccer players, actors, who basically are responsible for caring for their own kids. And you know, these in the process of this reality show, men are appreciating the maternal role in Korea, and it's you know, and kind of really elevating the role and status of men and their families through the show. And so you see these kind of like K-pop stars who seem to, you know, I think really kind of leverage the soft power that Korea has. And so now like this organization doesn't need to look maybe to Western men, and actually has a lot of other sources to kind of draw upon, so-called idealized examples of involved fathers. So almost so and then I only have a couple more slides here, but you know, men actually learn how to engage in two-way conversations with kids, right? They're told to praise kids. They're told to say "I love you," right? Like, you know, most, like, I don't think American dads actually go through this kind of training. I was born in San Francisco, but this might be kind of so yeah, men actually have to learn how to do these things, and so they actually draw upon U.S. self-help books written by white men, right? And so they actually use these kind of examples to teach men how to do it right in many ways. And so at the end of the day, I think what's being told here is kind of a story about race, masculinity, and globalization. So they're training men to assimilate this new man masculinity. And on the one hand, it's associated with white Western masculinity, and they're denigrating Korean masculinity. But at the same time, I think what you're finding is this kind of the elevation, I think, of kind of Korean masculinity at the same time. So the question is, do you see this kind of rise of a transnational kind of hegemonic masculinity that's not, you know, maybe that's no longer exclusively associated with Western men per se? I mean, it might have been because of the soft power of South Korea, potentially. So that's one potential reason. And finally, I think to kind of critique the organization at some level, you know, I think Father School, they failed to kind of problematize institutional structures like corporate arrangements, right? So it's more about kind of self-help strategies versus like changing broader structural conditions, you know, that don't allow men to be with their families, right? So, I mean, even the men, they know that, you know, they're spending the majority of their time at work. And within East Asia, Korean men spend the most time committed to work. And, you know, but I think through their participation, they kind of view fatherhood, it's kind of raised in salience in terms of their identity structure. This is why I included the word master identity, right? It influences every aspect of their life as a brother, as a son, as a father, as a citizen. And so it takes kind of a central role in their life. And I think finally what I'd like to say is that I think that what's important to kind of highlight is that men's journey from being a distant patriarch to an expressive dad is really about kind of also recognizing the importance of having a therapeutic community. And this is kind of this idea that actually Asian men come together and try to kind of work through their father wounds, work through their kind of challenges in their family. I think probably is another really kind of important area that we need to kind of consider in the future, right? So you've seen this with Western men. You see the mythopoetic movement, which started in the UK, I believe. We have the Promise Keeper movement, which started in the United States. And so I think this movement kind of draws attention to some of these non-Western gatherings of men who are trying to make sense of what it means to be a man in contemporary society. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you for it's a fascinating exploration of the development of what you call South Korean masculinities and how that intersects with white Western or perhaps Christian white Western masculinities, and how that has perhaps led to a hybrid perhaps type of masculinity in the context of your study. So thank you very much. We'll move to questions later.